Hi, good morning, Neil Sean here, literally in the heart of London. And today I thought we'd take you on a simple sort of journey through history. One, in fact, that resonates with all royal watchers, because behind me here is the former love nest of the one and only Wallis Simpson. And I thought today we'd take a look at how Wallis's story slightly resonates with another American that entered the British royal family, that of course of Meghan Markle. They say we're literally in the heart of London. This is George Street off Marble Arch. This was the love nest of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, otherwise known as Wallis Simpson and the former king. But looking back in history, one wonders exactly, do the stories of yesteryear still really resonate with people today? And more importantly, are there very many similarities between Wallis and of course Meghan Markle? Many royal watchers have speculated that there are, but I've unearthed a few secrets that I wanted to share with you, literally outside Wallis's former home. Wallis Simpson, you see, has been given something of a bad rap when you look through history. Lots of people have said that, yeah, she literally broke up the British royal family at a very difficult time. And of course, the path of royal history could have been totally different. But was it all really her doing? Did she in fact get in deeper than she'd actually anticipated it to be? And more importantly, is something similar happening with today's ex-royals, Meghan and Harry? If you take a look at Meghan and Wallis's story, they were both super ambitious people, both loved the world of fame and designer clothes, living well, and more importantly, they were slightly addicted, shall we say, to being talked about. Whichever way people say, Wallis Simpson, became a huge influencer of her day. And Meghan Markle, to a degree, has become something similar. They always talk about, of course, that they don't really want to be in the media, they want to live a private life. But this is a woman who spent years cultivating that said media. And Wallis Simpson, once the media got a grip of her, also enjoyed a very, very similar relationship. She was in fact one of the very first influencers, simply because designer stores, haute couture, that sort of thing, they paid her to be dressed in their clothing. And of course they could drop these clothing brands within the royal columns, the newspapers of the day, the gossip society. More importantly, I think it's interesting to note that Wallis herself really didn't mind being photographed holding bags. This was in an era when people of her stature simply didn't go out and shop. But she liked to be climbing into her chauffeur-driven car with the bag of Selfridges or Harrods very much in prominent positions, so that people would know she was a woman of affluence. So how do Meghan and Wallis's story really correlate? Well, it's interesting when you think, simply because, of course, they both have kind of ended up in a similar position. Both claim that they really didn't want to be members of the British royal family. Both claim that they actually wanted to bail out and live a quiet life. But is it really true? The former home of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor recently sold, well, about 5 years ago for over $5 million. That's a lot of money. It's a 3-bedroom flat, and as you can see from these new pictures here, it's been extensively remodeled. But this really is a place in history. This is where the affair was conducted from, and this is where the king at the time would secretly be deposited via, of course, his chauffeur-driven royal car to meet Wallis in private, normally while Ernest was away. Now, Ernest Simpson was a very clever man. He knew how to make money, and that's really what appealed to Wallis. She'd come from rather, well, difficult background, shall we say, and wanted, which was rather strange for a woman of her time, simply to be looked after. Well, not strange actually, because lots of women wanted to be looked after. They were society ladies. They expected to be looked after. So by the time that Wallis had actually married Ernest, he was doing incredibly well. But it was at this address here that things started to go wrong. Simply because, of course, the Great Depression of the 1930s. Now, what really turned Wallis's mind against Ernest was simply this. He basically said they had to cut down on all the parties and, more importantly, get rid of their chauffeur. Now, for her, this was a big turning point, simply because, of course, she felt that the chauffeur was a status. She could go to afternoon tea parties, meet with society friends, and more importantly, of course, it was a status within the society. Now, cutting down on the parties meant one thing. She couldn't invite the future king at that time to their parties. When the couple started their relationship in 1933, 3 years before Edward was crowned king, it was at this luxurious apartment in Bryanston Court on George Street, which was once owned by the American socialite, where the couple would meet, and many of their love letters would carry that address. Despite the apartment's historic past, it was refused a blue plaque by English Heritage in 2008 due to the allegations that Simpson had had an even more controversial affair than her one with the King of England. Now, this was never proven, but apparently Wallis was accused of having a relationship with Hitler's ambassador to London and giving him details of British troop movements during the Second World War. Apparently the ambassador would also visit this apartment, and that's the reason why, despite all those historical attachments, it simply can't have a blue plaque. Now, we've all heard the stories prior to marrying Meghan Markle that Prince Harry famously said, "Whatever Meghan wants, Meghan gets." And that's been part of the problem through royal history, simply because the king at the time had a similar problem with Wallis Simpson. She truly believed that she could become queen. Forget what they actually say about she didn't want to be. He assured her that this would take place, or indeed he would abdicate. Now, he had no plans really to do that. It was a veiled threat. And even Winston Churchill, an MP at the time, visited them at this flat to assure them that he didn't really think it would come to anything like that. So you can imagine how Wallis thought, well, wow, not only now am I secure financially, but I could become the Queen of England too. Now, do you see the similarities between Harry and Meghan, Wallis, and then, of course, the King of England? So you can imagine how certain parts of history do repeat themselves. Remember in the Oprah interview where, of course, Meghan claimed that titles didn't really mean anything, particularly royal titles, but then went on to moan that, well, her son really should have been given a title. Now, why didn't Prince Harry actually point out that this isn't actually an automatic? This was the problem, very similarly, of course, that the then king had with Wallis. She kind of felt that, well, I could become Queen of England, I could live with it. Just think of all the riches, the servants, the travel. She didn't really, of course, foresee having to troop round and meet the actual public. Now, does that ring any bells? When you think about it, when Meghan and Harry decided to get married, and of course he took her on that tour of England to meet the public, did anybody truly buy that Meghan Markle could be stuck up in, say, Rotherham or Sheffield on a wet Wednesday, literally meeting the British public? She'd been used to a more celebrity lifestyle, again, as she said in the Oprah Winfrey interview. Now, here's where it gets truly interesting for me, simply because Wallis and David, as he was then known, ran out of money very quickly, simply because he couldn't keep up with her demands for the latest fashion, makeup, and of course, jewels. Now, you will also recall that Wallis, very similar to Meghan, was quite keen to forge her own name, her own brand. There was talk about perfume, makeup, designer clothes, all bearing the Wallis Simpson brand. It would have been very lucrative, but for whatever reason in that particular era, it didn't come off. Of course, a similar sort of thing with Meghan was that she had her own lifestyle blog and regularly promoted things like Bobbi Brown. She knew, of course, the power of her, star quality, if you like, even though she was only in a cable TV show. And then there was that infamous chat at the Disney premiere where Prince Harry, desperate to get his wife some work, tried to chat up the boss of Disney. Now, all really that resulted in was this: a voiceover for an elephant documentary that truly nobody remembers. But you have to admire him. He was truly, really kind of looking out for the woman that he loves. And this is exactly what happened to the former king. He was basically looking for revenue streams, as we call today, to see how he could sustain the lifestyle that they both become very used to. Now, here's an exclusive. Way back in the late 1930s, this man could have changed the course of their lives. He is Louis B. Mayer, and he was the head of MGM Studios in Culver City, California. Now, let me explain. Both of them didn't want to become movie stars, but they were offered a deal at the time that could have changed their lives forever and simply made them financially secure. But the king, or ex-king as he was then known, really dug his heels in and managed to lose that particular deal. But why? MGM was the biggest movie studio in the world, and they had that mantra, more stars than there are in heaven. And that was truly said, because they had like Clark Gable, Judy Garland, Joan Crawford, Hedy Lamarr, you name it. Every major star wanted to be signed to MGM, and they were branching out. They decided to open a studio here in England. Now, Louis B. Mayer was a big thinker, a big star maker, and he was residing at the Savoy Hotel on the Strand, naturally in the most biggest and famous suite that the hotel had to offer. Dining at the Savoy was none other than the ex-king and Wallis Simpson. Now he went over to introduce himself, and that was a simple pleasantry, a get-together. But what followed was an idea, in Louis's head at least, that he thought would secure, well, worldwide publicity, and as he called it, really, on the cheap. When he got back to Culver City, he decided to sit down with his henchmen, or head of, well, certain departments of the studio, which were Eddie Mannix, who was something of a sort of mafia-type thug, and more importantly, very, very powerful in persuading people, particularly stars, to do what they wanted. The other person was the head of PR, Howard Strickland. So a meeting was duly set up, or so they thought. They wrote to Edward and Wallis in London and decided that they were going to offer them this mega deal to become the ambassador, the head of MGM British. Now, when it was put to Louis, well, what did Edward really know about making movies? He said, well, does it matter? He's the former King of England. Just think of the publicity this will generate. Very shrewd move, you could imagine. Now, the deal that was put on the table was worth around about £1 million a year in today's money, a lot of money in the late 1930s. But MGM was a very cash-rich studio. Phone calls were duly accepted, lots of chat back and forth with lawyers, and of course the former king went to Wallis and said this could be the end of all their financial troubles. And you'll see a pattern here, simply because while the negotiations were going well, and the ex-king quite liked the idea of simply getting paid just to be an ambassador, a head of a movie studio no less, the biggest one in the world, he also wanted a job for Wallis. So this is what he suggested. Now at first MGM decided, well, we didn't want Wallis. I mean, after all, she wasn't the most stunning looking of women. Yes, she was thin and she was known worldwide, but they'd already signed people like Marion Davis, and she hadn't done anything either. So no, they didn't really want any involvement from Wallis, but the ex-king was insistent. Now he suggested this particular idea. He felt that Wallis really could become the head of costume design at MGM, basically dressing the stars. And then they could do a side deal with the lesser expensive versions of the dresses that the stars would wear on screen. Louis B wasn't keen on that idea, and being Louis B, told the ex-king. The ex-king stuck his heels in, and basically the deal fell apart, simply because while they were still willing to press ahead and pay him to become the head of the studio, all that money, he said he wasn't going to do anything unless there was something that was going to involve Wallis. So lots of deals fell through. There were even talks of Wallis doing her own lipstick range with Revlon, all kinds of sort of money-making deals. Now do you see the pattern that's evolving? If you look at what they were doing back then, is there really anything different to what Harry and Meghan are doing now? So fast forward to 2021, and what are we seeing? We're actually seeing a former senior member of the British royal family sitting down with the wealthiest and most powerful billionaire on television in the world, revealing his secrets to a worldwide audience. But where does that leave them? Will their story end up very similar to, of course, Wallis and the ex-king? Now, Wallis herself, of course, went on to have a very fruitful life. She was never welcomed back into the royal family. That's all very well documented, simply because, of course, the Queen Mother wouldn't, well, give in. Now, we know that Wallis eventually was allowed back in for a very brief period towards the end of her life. But for Meghan Markle, she's played it very shrewdly, you see, because she, like Wallis, has kept into the background. She's let her royal associate do all the speaking for her. After all, she's not difficult, like Wallis wasn't difficult. And after all, it's Harry asking for things, like David did, or George, whichever you want to call him. Nothing to do with them. And more importantly, of course, their story remains part of history. Whichever way you look at it, there are very similarities between Meghan and Wallis. As I said at the start of this video, they both liked the fame that came with the job, but they didn't really want to do the work associated with it. When you look at the difference between, say, Catherine and Meghan, Catherine really embraces the royal role. She likes to meet people, her subjects, her public. Both her and William are a shining example of monarchy in the 21st century. What Harry and Meghan have done is make themselves look, well, rather foolish by revealing all their inner secrets, or more so, Harry's inner secrets. How can they possibly climb back from that? But the story doesn't end there. Wallis and David, of course, were the subject of many documentaries, books, films, even a film by Madonna, the pop queen herself, who's been a supporter of Meghan Markle. So now could we see their story in the future, Meghan and Harry's, being played out really through the, well, lens of the big screen? Harry himself isn't averse to this, and more importantly, he's always keen to get their side of the story out. But for now, it remains to be seen how their story will play out, or will they be exiled, like, of course, Wallis and David / George, the ex-King of England. But they'll always be part of history, and more importantly, they're still also very well connected. Neil Sean in the heart of London.